Hi everybody, good to see you again. This is the second half of the lecture for Chapter 18, the Politics of the Gilded Age chapter. And so that's kind of where we are, coming up on preparation for our exam on Wednesday, and that will be an essay exam. So when we last left our heroes, we were talking about Gilded Age politics. And we got up to the election of 1888. And you remember just a couple of things. First of all, this is a very corrupt period in U.S. history in terms of politics. The Republican Party had factioned between the stalwarts and the half-breeds by the 1880s. And that kind of came to a head with the assassination of Garfield in 1881. That led to a little bit of civil service reform with the Pendleton Act in 1883. Then, as you recall, by the election of 1884, James G. Blaine had some issues with the Irish vote, and so that allowed the first Democrat since before the Civil War to come into office, and that was Cleveland. Cleveland billed himself as a reformer by wanting to get rid or lower tariffs to stop the patronage machine. Now we'll pick it up at 1888. This is a close popular vote election, and Harrison, Benji Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, wins. He is a political machine-made candidate, and really there is not a whole lot that you need to know about him. I'm going to just pull up another PowerPoint for myself here. But what you need to know here is that we're kind of still in this whole idea of patronage, despite all of this change with the civil service reform and that sort of thing. That will take us to the election of 92, and much like 88, the Democrats will run Cleveland again against Harrison. Now, interestingly, Cleveland will win in 92 again, and so he is the president that has two terms non-sequentially, and so he'll win in 92. The other interesting thing about the election of 92 is that we begin to see the rise of the populist movement. Now, we're going to talk much more about the populist movement, but just briefly, let me tell you about Tom Watson and the populist movement. This is a movement that comes out of the 1870s and the Greenback Labor Party. Basically, all that stuff that we talked about with bimetallism and wanting inflation, that really kind of gains some momentum, and that's what is the impetus for the populists. The populists are the folks that really encourage the underclasses in voting and that sort of thing. So this really puts bimetallism and the ideas of the populists on the map. And so that's kind of what happens. Then we really do, by the 1890s, by the time we get to the election of 96, get kind of this crisis in this conflict around a gold standard versus bimetallism. Now, what really pushes this conflict is the idea that many European countries are going to a gold standard, and so there are the folks that are the bankers and that sort of thing in the United States want to move toward a gold standard, and they don't like the idea of putting more and more silver into our reserves, whereas the populists will want more and more silver to in order to create inflation and make it easier to pay back loans and that sort of thing for farmers, as well as to a degree industrial workers. So that's kind of what's going on during this time period. Also during this time period, we see the biggest panic in all of history to this point. The only one bigger will be in 1929 with the stock market crash and leading into the Great Depression, and we'll talk more about that later. But the Panic of 1893 really has a huge impact and causes a lot of labor unrest, and this really is momentum for the populist cause. We will have things like the Pullman strike, the Homestead Steel strike. Those are strikes that we have talked about already, but those really have an impact on politics in terms of populism during this time period. Another person that you should be familiar with is Marcus Hanna. Marcus Hanna is kind of the puppet master for the Republican Party. He is in Congress, and he really has a lot of pull in who runs for various political offices and that sort of thing. He's almost like a Boss Tweed, if you will. And long story short, what happens is that he will make sure that that McKinley becomes the candidate for the Republicans, William McKinley, in 1896. McKinley is what was called a gold bug, meaning that he is for a strict gold standard and not bimetallism. And that's what the Republicans want. They want a deflationary cycle, and so that businesses make more money and that sort of thing. And so they run McKinley, and Hanna is kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. The Democrats have a tough time. You know that they've had a tough time getting momentum ever since the end of the Civil War. And so what happens is that they have their convention in 1896, and they really don't have any odds-on favorites. And so people are giving speeches and that sort of thing, and along comes William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska, and they called him the young silver-tongued orator of the Platte. He was really good at giving speeches, and he gives perhaps his most famous speech, which is just electrifying at the convention, and this is called the Cross of Gold speech. And this is the speech that will really catapult him into the Democratic Party nomination, and catapult populism into that platform wholesale. And so that's really what happens with Bryan. Basically, the Cross of Gold speech is an admonition for bimetallism, and it really resonates with the working classes, which are primarily Democratic. And so 1896 really heats up as a clash between the gold bugs, that's the Republicans who want a gold standard, and the bimetallism, or the free silverites, which are the Democrats. And so that's what's happening in 1896. In 1896, you see the popular vote is fairly close, 47% for Bryan to 51% for McKinley, but the electoral vote is not as close, with McKinley winning. And thus the bimetallism takes a real shot, as does populism. It doesn't die. It'll kind of die by 1900 with the Gold Standard Act, when McKinley gets reelected, but it really takes a shot here. So the free silver movement really loses momentum after this. All right, so that's kind of the rest of politics up to 1900. In 1900, McKinley will get reelected. He runs against William Jennings Bryan again, and by 1900, the new issue of imperialism really comes out. But we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But for our exam on Wednesday, this is what you need to know up through the end of chapter 18. So, thanks for listening, and we will talk to you later.